On the night of May 29, 1984, after searching the streets of Kenosha, Wisconsin for over an hour, the mother of 9-year-old Vernita Wheat contacts the police.
Well, the mother told us that she had a boyfriend and that he had asked if he could take Vernita to a carnival, and it was around 11 o'clock that they hadn't returned home yet.
Vernita's mother describes her boyfriend.
He met her about a month and a half before May 29th and said that he was Robert Knight, that he lived on 20th Street in Kenosha, and actually showed Mrs. Wheat some identification. He went to her house maybe 2 or 3 times a week. They would make dinner. He was very engaging, charismatic.
And through a process of stopping by, he gained her confidence.
To the point where she trusted him with her only daughter. Police get a photo of Vernita and promise her mother they will do everything in their power to find her.
They were not at the carnival they were supposed to be at. We actually had no place really to look for them anymore.
I went to the address that Robert Knight said he lived in Kenosha and discovered that that address doesn't exist. The Kenosha police have Juanita come into their station. They don't have a Robert Knight in any records, so they have her go through their mug shot books, and she picks out the picture that she thought was Robert Knight, but in actuality is Alton Coleman.
And 28-year-old Alton Coleman is no stranger to law enforcement.
The Kenosha police realizes they have a subject with a history of rapes, and they immediately start looking for him. Alton Coleman was a resident of Waukegan. Obviously, the first logical place to start looking for him would have been where he lived.
Waukegan police officially joined Kenosha police in the search.
We executed a search warrant at what is his grandmother's apartment. We meet with his grandmother. She's elderly, she's blind. We meet a person who's by the name of Debra Brown, who says that she is his girlfriend. She has very little information other than Coleman lived there.
Unable to find Coleman, police bring his girlfriend, 21-year-old Debra Brown, in for questioning. Brown admits that Coleman had been gone overnight and was acting strange when he finally returned home the next morning. But she claims to not know why.
Debra Brown seemed to be cooperative with us. She seemed to give us the information freely.
But when asked where Coleman is, Brown claims to have no idea. Believing she is telling the truth, police let her go.
When we finish questioning Debra, we feel that we need to do everything to find this little girl, because she had not been seen for a couple of days. Was she being held somewhere?
Law enforcement officers in 2 states urgently search for Alton Coleman and the missing 9-year-old in hopes of finding her before it's too late.
Well, I was out there as an APB, and we certainly were looking around. But Kenosha's a large city. Alton had no contacts within the city of Kenosha, so we had no addresses whatsoever.
We later discovered that he tried to purchase a gun from an acquaintance. We learned that he tried to call some people to obtained money. He had been seen by a Waukegan police officer near his sister's house, and it took off running, and that he borrowed a car but later stole the car from a friend of his. So we know he's on the run, and he's on the run because he's done something very horrible.
As days pass with no trace of Alton Coleman or Vernita Wheat, authorities retrace their steps.
We go back to talk to Debra Brown again. We discover she's missing. We later get information that she's last seen with somebody who looked like Alton Coleman.
Based on Coleman's past criminal record and the fact that Brown has disappeared, a federal jury indicts both of them for the kidnapping of Vernita Wheat. But Coleman and Brown are nowhere to be found. Then, on June 18th,
about 2.5 weeks after the initial kidnapping occurred, the Waukegan police received a phone call from two men that had entered an abandoned building. They walked into one of the abandoned apartments and wedged in the door of a bathroom. They found a body.
Investigators' worst fears come true when the body is identified as Vernita Wheat.
The body was badly decomposed. Her hands and legs had been bound with cable. The cause of death turned out to be strangulation. We could not determine that there was any sexual assault. We could only assume that there was.
I've been to several murder scenes. I prosecuted several homicides, and I don't think there's one that I've ever forgotten. Anytime a child is involved, it's been such a traumatic event that's going to affect so many people, you just don't forget them. What would have possessed someone to commit such an offense against such a young child?
We're directly across the street from 114 Belvedere, or where it used to exist. It was a 2- or 3-story apartment building that was abandoned at the time. This scene is still fresh in my mind. It was not only the investigators, it was the evidence technicians, it was the officials from the coroner's office. I think every one of us remembers that site that day.
Waukegan police dusted 4 fingerprints, and on the bottom third of the bathroom door were 2 fingerprints, and one was the thumbprint of Alton Coleman.
It confirmed what we thought all along, that Coleman had killed this little girl, and that we need to do everything we can to catch him. There was a lot of fear because we had not caught him. We did not know where he was. Was he still on the streets of Waukegan? Was he in Kenosha? No one knew. We didn't know.
On June 18th, after being found wandering in a wooded area, a 9-year-old girl is brought to a hospital in Gary, Indiana. An examination reveals she has been beaten, choked, and sexually assaulted. When police arrive, the girl tells them that she and a 7-year-old relative, Tamika Turks, were taken to the woods and attacked by a man and a woman. The next day, searchers find Tamika's lifeless body. She had also been beaten and sexually assaulted before being killed.
Tamika was strangled with a bedsheet, and the other little girl who lay in the field watched this occur. She was then sexually assaulted, and a belt was put around her neck and tightened until she passed out, and they left her for dead.
The surviving victim is able to provide police a description of her attackers.
We're watching the local Chicago news, and they're of course reporting our discovery of Vernita Wheat's body. And they tell another story about how 2 girls were assaulted and one was killed in Gary, Indiana. My first inclination was, well, let's not blame Coleman on every murder. And then in a short few minutes after you heard more of that report, I think that this had turned into a multiple homicide spree at this time.
And for Alton Coleman and Debra Brown, it was only the beginning. In the summer of 1984, federal and local law enforcement are on the hunt for 28-year-old Alton Coleman and his girlfriend, 21-year-old Debra Brown. Both are wanted for kidnappings in Wisconsin and Indiana that left 2 little girls dead and another seriously injured.
We had at least 100 local police and FBI agents searching the areas.
The search is made all the more difficult by a paranoid public.
We had almost 200 sightings of Coleman, and none of them were ever confirmed as him. So people would see somebody that remotely looked like him, and out of fear would call in.
For law enforcement, this is not the first time they have searched for Alton Coleman.
The first time that I was aware that Mr. Coleman existed was he had been part of a robbery, kidnapping, and rape of a Waukegan restaurant owner. He got convicted of robbery in that case.
Back in 1979, I was assigned to prosecute a sexual assault case where Mr. Coleman was the defendant. Mr. Coleman testified in that case, and I believe that the jury believed his story, and he managed to convince them that he was not guilty. And that was probably my first-hand view of Alton Coleman's ability to charm people.
Alton Coleman was a pure con man. He has the ability to talk his way in and out of situations.
Alton Coleman was born in 1955 in Waukegan, Illinois.
Alton grew up with his grandmother. His mother had abandoned him as a young child. He grew up in a very low-income area of Waukegan.
To make ends meet, Alton's grandmother ran a brothel and gambling parlor out of her home. From a young age, Alton acts out antisocial behaviors, including breaking windows in the housing projects where he lives.
Alton Coleman was a conduct disorder child, someone who doesn't like following the rules, someone who may be setting fire, someone who may be bedwetting.
He had a difficult and challenging youth because he would, under certain circumstances, soil himself.
Some neighborhood kids picked up on that, and he obtained the nickname of Pissy, and it never left him.
The fact that he was teased for wetting his pants and called Pissy did nothing more than add to the basic personality he already had. And he began, in certain ways, to show absolute disrespect for authority and did what he wanted to do. Alton Coleman started out with petty crime. He did not see any type of punishment.
Alton tells others it is his devotion to voodoo that protects him from prosecution and incarceration.
He has no respect for authority because there was never any authority given.
Emboldened by the absence of consequence, Alton graduates to more serious offenses. And in 1973, at the age of 18, he is arrested for sexual assault, a crime he will be arrested for 5 more times over the next 10 years. He is acquitted on all but one. While serving a prison sentence, Alton gains a reputation for molesting and forcibly having sex with other male inmates. Prison psychiatrist's profile labels Coleman a pansexual, willing to have intercourse with any object, man, woman, or child.
He was a sexual predator. He had no conscience.
In late 1983, Coleman meets 21-year-old Debra Brown.
Debra Brown was a member of a family of 11 children. Everyone took care of one another.
She didn't have much education, had a lower IQ.
Her intelligence quotient ranged from 59 to something like 75. And if you looked only at the numbers, she would have been considered mildly mentally retarded. She did have something that was called passive dependent personality disorder, and she needed to be able to depend on someone. Coleman deliberately had the mindset of choosing Debra Brown. He somehow knew that she was the perfect partner. She sees him as kind and caring. She sees him as wanting to make her life wonderful, and she falls under the spell because she will do anything to have this man in her life.
He was able to identify vulnerable people he could prey on.
Debra Brown was under his spell. She's in lust, and she's in love. She also knew that whatever Alton told her to do, she would do. Even though she knew it was wrong.
Authorities know they have not one, but 2 dangerous criminals on the loose, and that makes them twice as deadly. On June 19, 1984, in Gary, Indiana, 25-year-old Donna Williams is reported missing by her parents, who tell police she was on her way to pick up some new friends.
Alton Coleman met Donna Williams, and they talked about going to church. And he wanted to confess and be a part of the church that Donna Williams was involved in.
One of the things that Alton Coleman was able to develop, like all psychopaths, is the capacity to be, in appearance, not dangerous. I mean, he doesn't come up to somebody and pull a knife and say, "Come with me." He develops the relationship.
1 week later, Donna Williams' car is found abandoned in Detroit, Michigan. There is no sign of Donna, but police find a forged identification card with Brown's picture. That same day, Coleman and Brown abduct a Detroit woman by knife point and order her to drive to Ohio. The woman intentionally crashes her vehicle and runs off. Coleman and Brown take off with the car. On June 28th, a Dearborn Heights couple is brutally attacked in their home by Alton Coleman and Debra Brown, who rob them and steal their car.
They acted like animals. They didn't care who, they didn't care how, they didn't care where, they didn't care anything about the victims.
Debra Brown just said, "Okay, let's go." No matter what she had to do, her pleasure in these crimes was seeing Alton happy.
I believe these were all victims of opportunity. Whether it was to get money, whether it was to get to a car, whether it was to get food, they just moved on to the next victim.
In July of 1984, Alton Coleman and Debra Brown are on a rampage across the Midwest that has led to the deaths of 2 children and the savage assault of others.
For Alton Coleman, the motivation was sexual pleasure and sadistic pleasure in hurting someone. That was his motive. Debra's motive was to do whatever Alton wanted her to do. And her pleasure was making him feel good.
Authorities across 4 states relentlessly hunt the couple down, determined to stop them before they strike again.
It was the most intensified, detailed investigation that I had ever been a part of. Here we have 2 people picking people out of nowhere other than their vulnerability, and it's kind of fearful. I mean, this wasn't 2 hardened gang people walking down the street that everybody would fear. They looked like a couple and were able to prey on anybody.
How you doing, sir?
On July 7th, we know that Alton Coleman went to a home in Toledo, Ohio, of Mr. and Mrs. Duvendeck. And in the ruse of wanting to buy a used car that was for sale on their street, he put a gun to their head and stole their car and also took money.
He only preyed on those that were weaker than him, or smaller than him, or older than him. He did this on purpose. He picked them out so they couldn't defend themselves.
It's a predator-prey situation. The predator knows that the victim is vulnerable. He knows that the prey is available.
Despite all their efforts, the police can't seem to catch up with the pair. In Toledo, Ohio, when relatives of 30-year-old Virginia Temple do not hear from her or her 10-year-old daughter, they contact the police on July 11th.
Virginia Temple and her daughter were found in the crawl space. Virginia Temple had been strangled and gagged with a baby's t-shirt. Her daughter had been sexually assaulted and strangled as well.
Alton Coleman's footprint is found on an article of clothing near one of the bodies.
Debra Brown and Alton Coleman were very sloppy. But it wasn't that they wanted to get caught. There was an arrogance to their crimes where they felt they didn't need to hide.
That same day that the bodies of Virginia Temple and her daughter are found, the remains of Donna Williams are discovered in an abandoned house in Detroit. She had been strangled to death with a pair of pantyhose.
The murders that Coleman and Brown committed were as vicious as any homicides that I ever investigated or I ever heard or read about. I mean, they were cold-hearted murders.
The search for Coleman and Brown intensifies as even more communities are put on alert.
We were receiving information that the possibility of those two being in the area. There's concern. Do you really expect to open your door and talk to somebody in a civilized manner and expect them to turn around and brutally attack you and kill you? Of course not. That's where these cowards got the advantage.
Hello?
On July 13th, 19-year-old Sherry Walters discovers her parents, Harry and Marlene, brutalized in the basement of their Norwood, Ohio home.
Harry and Marlene had a pop-up camper for sale in their yard. Alton Coleman and Debra Brown approached them with the story that they may want to purchase that camper. Harry and Marlene, being trusting people, invited them inside the house, offered them something cold to drink. As soon as they walked back into the living room is when they brutally attacked them with anything they could hit them with. They were bludgeoned. She was beat to death, and Harry was beat to within an inch of his life. I really don't know how he survived. I really don't. I'm sure they believed that they had killed him.
Police processed the scene of the crime. But for some, it's more than business as usual.
I knew Harry and Marlene because we had grown up together, and in both cases attended grade school and high school together. But it's not going to do any good for me to become personally involved. You have a job to do. In other words, if you want to find out who did this act, then you do it in a professional manner, do your case right, and then you worry about it later on.
The FBI makes Alton Coleman a special addition to the 11th spot on their 10 most wanted list, an option used when vicious crimes in progress mark a suspect as extremely dangerous.
For Alton Coleman, there was never going to be an end. He was on a spree. Debra Brown will do anything to make him happy. They are not psychotic. They're not out of touch with reality. They're just killing to kill.
Authorities are out in full force, hoping to stop the elusive couple before they strike again.
When criminal conduct escalates, then I think one of the first concerns in law enforcement, when the victims start ending up as homicide victims, you wonder whether or not this person has decided that he's going to eliminate witnesses, which I think prompts law enforcement to put all their resources into trying to locate the offender.
As time goes out, your chances of apprehension decrease, so you have to stay on it fast, hard, as early as you can, and take it as far as you can.
A task made even more difficult by the unpredictability of the couple, who grow more brazen with each attack.
As with most couple murderers, they are empowered. They feel that they are beyond being found, being caught, being punished. The dynamic of this couple is that they almost become one. Alton Coleman and Debra Brown became one organism. The organism that Coleman and Brown became fed on these murders. It maintained their relationship.
It does seem that as they go along, she participates more so in them. Almost like she's moved up to his level.
A level of impulsive violence from which no one is safe. "45-year-old college professor Oline Carmichael Jr. is carjacked and kidnapped in Lexington, Kentucky on July 16th. Coleman and Brown then drive to Dayton, Ohio, where they abandon the car. Carmichael survives. On July 17th, in Dayton, Coleman and Brown attack an 82-year-old reverend and his 76-year-old wife, who just the week before had helped the couple and given them a place to stay. The reverend and his wife barely survive.
Survivors of these types of attacks are never the same. You never regain that basic kernel of trust. And even though people say you, quote, survive, you are never, ever capable of regaining that innocence, of being able to trust another individual. You never regain it, not deep down.
Coleman and Brown steal the reverend's car and drive it to Evanston, Illinois. But not before first beating up and robbing another elderly Dayton couple along the way.
They wanted something, they stole whatever they could get their hands on. A car, a ring, a jewelry, a few bucks. If they stole the automobile, they would dump the automobile, pick up a couple of bicycles, ride, and then do it again.
Coleman deliberately had the mindset of choosing Debra Brown. But she was a willing participant. She wasn't a hostage. Debra seemed to be so excited about pleasing Alton and doing what Alton wanted her to do, no matter how violent these crimes.
2 days after Coleman and Brown leave Ohio, the body of 15-year-old Tani Story is found in an abandoned building in Cincinnati. Story had been stabbed several times and shot in the head, but ultimately died of strangulation. Witnesses place her in the company of Coleman and Brown. And a bracelet belonging to victim Virginia Temple is found under Story's body. The reasoning behind the obvious placement of the evidence is a cause for speculation.
I believe that Coleman, and with the assistance of Brown, was starting to enjoy the celebrity status of being a serial murderer. He left evidence. He knew he was going to be identified as the murderer, as well as Debra Brown.
Alton Coleman and Debra Brown go on a spree of killing for the total pleasure of it. They're thrill kills.
On July 19th, a vehicle stolen by Coleman and Brown is located at a car wash in Indianapolis, Indiana. Eugene Scott, the car wash's 77-year-old owner, is missing. Police later discover his body in a ditch. He had been shot 4 times in the head.
These psychopaths and predators have no conscience. It was always in Alton Coleman's mind that he was going to murder these people. So it wasn't a switch. It was taking off the mask. And in her mind, Debra Brown sees Alton Coleman as this golden person. And whether he does commit murders, whether he doesn't commit murders, she would follow him into hell.
In mid-July 1984, a climate of fear grips the Midwest as Alton Coleman and Debra Brown continue their crime spree, preying on the weak and kind-hearted.
Alton Coleman took advantage of trusting people, and then in a cowardly way, he attacked, brutally murdered them, and took their possessions.
When Coleman and Brown were committing these murders, My initial thought that Brown was just following Coleman's lead. She was more of a willing participant than even I had anticipated.
Debra Brown wasn't an individual who was threatened or in a domestic violence relationship. Debra Brown became a willing participant to the point where she would often help approach the victims first.
She was just as vicious, just as cold, just as cowardly as he was.
With not one, but two savage killers on the loose, law enforcement used everything at their disposal to bring an end to the unrelenting mayhem.
The FBI did a profile. It had predicted that they would head back to Waukegan. We prepared for that. We briefed our patrol units, we briefed all our policemen. The FBI agent went to Evanston, and he briefed them. He placed a lot of the wanted posters all over Evanston, Illinois.
We've oftentimes seen that someone who commits such an offense oftentimes maneuvers back to the scene of the original crime.
Anticipating the couple's next move, authorities cast a wide net in a massive push to stop Coleman and Brown once and for all.
Coleman and Brown were seen in a park in Evanston, Illinois, by somebody who knew them. He called the Evanston police. Did they want it to end in what we call today police suicides, where they wanted us to kill them in the apprehension? Or did they want to get caught and gain the publicity that they thought they had obtained as serial murders?
Brown, Coleman, freeze, get your hands in the air.
No way of telling.
On July 20th, 1984, Alton Coleman and Debra Brown are arrested, bringing an end to their 53-day reign of terror.
They found a knife on Coleman, gun on Debra Brown. They didn't give them the opportunity to hurt anybody else, and the capture went, in police terms, went perfect.
There was some speculation that he may have been tired of running, that Alton Coleman had decided that he'd been on the run and that he didn't want to run anymore.
And for us, we're glad they're caught, we're glad they're in custody. But for our residents and the victims, they're now off the street. That was the big deal.
During their 8-week rampage, Coleman and Brown are believed to have committed 8 homicides, 7 rapes, 3 kidnappings, and 14 armed robberies.
It was a great relief that he was in custody and that we would now be able to move ahead with seeking justice.
Prosecutors in 20 jurisdictions meet to decide how to move forward with their cases against Coleman and Brown.
Part of the consideration of who would prosecute the case first would be whether they would seek capital punishment. The decision was made that the first case would go to Ohio.
After months of pretrial preparation, Alton Coleman and Debra Brown are first tried for the kidnapping of Oline Carmichael. And on January 7th, 1985, a judge sentences them to 20 years in prison. The other trials follow in quick succession, and on April 30th, Coleman and Brown are sentenced to death for the murder of Marlene Walters. followed less than a month later by another death sentence each for the murder of Tani Story.
I think there is some closure when there's a conviction in court, but the one thing that the court system probably will never do is return that family or that mother back to where they were prior to the crime.
Throughout the trials, Debra Brown remains loyal to Alton Coleman.
She was very highly protective of him. She was extremely reluctant, which is unusual for many defendants, to tell her story, which would have to implicate her boyfriend, Alton Coleman. Whereas, on the other hand, Alton Coleman just saw her as a disposable piece of property. He had no emotional attachment to her and would have killed Debra Brown at any point in time where he felt that she was not going to be at his beck and call, because he had no conscience.
Coleman and Brown are extradited to Indiana, where on May 2nd, Alton Coleman is sentenced to death for a third time for the murder of Tamika Turks, and an additional 100 years for the assault and attempted murder of the surviving victim. Debra Brown receives the same punishment.
Debra Brown would not have committed these crimes without Alton Coleman or someone else who was able to find her vulnerabilities. But Debra Brown was not a murderer. She became a murderer. Debra Brown became a murderer because of Alton Coleman.
Alton Coleman is then extradited to Illinois to stand trial in the murder of Vernita Wheat. Debra Brown is not charged for the crime. She is returned to Ohio, where she is placed on death row.
There were 3 death penalty convictions already for Alton Coleman, and when we received him in 1986, we only looked at the picture of Vernita Wheat, this little girl, and our decision was made to continue prosecuting him.
The trial begins on January 15th, 1987, and ends on January 24th, with a guilty verdict and another death sentence.
After they came back with their decision that he was going to receive the death penalty, the jury asked the judge if they could see Matt Chansey and I. We went back into the jury room, and they were standing and clapping for us.
With this, his 4th death sentence, Alton Coleman becomes the first person ever sentenced to death in 3 states. He attempts to get his sentences overturned on appeal by arguing, among other things, that he was neglected and abused as a child.
Sociopaths are born, basically. They're not made. You don't become a con man or a psychopath because you've been teased. You become one because you're born that way.
The relatives of the victims don't care what kind of childhood you had. Nobody should care. These individuals took these lives in a brutal fashion. That's what they should care about. I don't want to hear excuses.
In 1991, the governor of Ohio commutes Debra Brown's death sentence before leaving office. He cites Brown's mild retardation, stating she suffers from childlike emotional development and had a master-slave relationship with Coleman.
In my opinion, although Debra Brown had an IQ that would have been measured in the mildly mentally retarded range, it did not impact what she did with Alton Coleman. Mental retardation for Debra Brown may have been that she was not successful in school, but she was quite capable of functioning on a day-to-day basis. Debra Brown knew what she was doing. She knew what she was doing was wrong, and she continued to do it knowing it was wrong.
I was disappointed, to say the least. She should have been executed, and she escaped execution. It made me sick. It made me feel like the people who made that decision should have been at the crime scene instead of looking at some sniveling individual behind bars and commuting their sentence.
After exhausting all of his appeals, on April 26th, 2002, 46-year-old Alton Coleman is executed by lethal injection at Mansfield Correctional Institution near Lucasville, Ohio. Due to the large number of requests to witness the execution from victims and victims' families, a closed-circuit broadcast is set up to accommodate as many as possible.
Did I attend the execution? No. I made an attempt, but I was told that the seats were taken and I could not get a seat. Some people will tell you, well, I don't want to witness an execution. Well, when you start that case and you know that's what the outcome is, I figure I'll be there and watch it till its conclusion.
I guess in the end, Alton Coleman was just the scum of the earth. Didn't care who. Certainly didn't care how old. Didn't care about their vulnerability. He did it for thrill. He did it over money. There was no chance that this guy could ever be rehabilitated. And certainly the victims are served by him never, ever being able to ever be out in the public again.
Debra Brown is currently in the Ohio Reformatory for Women. Should she ever be released, Brown still faces the death penalty in Indiana.